Picture this. You're standing in the shadows of Westminster Abbey on a cold, autumn morning in 1396. The ancient stone walls echo with whispered conversations as nobles gather for what they recalling the most extraordinary wedding England has ever witnessed. Then the bride arrives, and your breath catches in your throat. She's tiny, barely tall enough to see over the altar rail, her delicate hand completely swallowed by the groom's massive palm. This is no ordinary political marriage. This Isabella of Valois, all of 6 years old, about to become Queen of England by marrying a king who could literally be her father. But this isn't just another tale of medieval brutality. This is the story of a little girl who would navigate the treacherous waters of royal politics with intelligence that defied her age, survive the collapse of kingdoms, and ultimately reshape the very nature of diplomatic marriage in medieval Europe. To understand Isabella's extraordinary fate, we need to step into the world of 1389 Paris, where power was measured in bloodlines and madness lurked behind palace walls. Isabella was born into the French royal family at one of the most unstable periods in European history. Her father, King Charles VI of France, suffered from what medieval chroniclers called the King's Evil, sudden, terrifying episodes where he would forget his own identity, believe his body was made of glass, or refuse to bathe for months while convinced that assassins lurked in every shadow. Imagine being a small child in such a household. One day, your father might shower you with affection and expensive gifts from across his empire. The next, you might find him cowering in a corner, screaming that invisible enemies were closing in for the kill. Palace servants would whisk the royal children away during these episodes, but the fear and confusion followed them through the marble corridors of the Louvre. Isabella's mother, Isabella of Bavaria, was a woman forged by necessity into one of medieval Europe's shrewdest political operators. While her husband battled his inner demons, she held the kingdom together through sheer force of will and political cunning. But Isabeau understood something crucial about the medieval world. Children, especially royal daughters, were the most valuable diplomatic assets a kingdom possessed. By the time Isabella had learned to walk, her mother was already calculating her worth on the international marriage market. This wasn't cruelty. This was survival. France was locked in a death struggle with England that had already lasted nearly 60 years. The 100 Years' War had turned both kingdoms into bleeding, exhausted giants, their treasuries empty, their people desperate for peace. The war had consumed entire generations. French villages lay in smoking ruins from English raids. English nobles had bankrupted themselves financing campaigns across the Channel. Both kingdoms were reaching the point where continued fighting might destroy them completely, regardless of who eventually claimed victory. It was into this cauldron of exhaustion and desperation that Isabella's fate was cast. In the secret chambers where medieval diplomacy was conducted, French and English ambassadors began exploring an idea so audacious it seemed almost impossible. What if they could end the war, not through conquest, but through marriage? The English king, Richard II, presented both an opportunity and a challenge. At 29, he was intelligent, cultured, and genuinely grief-stricken by the recent death of his beloved first wife, Anne of Bohemia. Anne had been known as Good Queen Anne for her charity and gentleness, and her death from plague had left Richard not only heartbroken, but dangerously vulnerable, a king without an heir in a world where succession disputes could tear kingdoms apart. Richard's advisors were pressuring him to remarry immediately, but the king initially resisted. His marriage to Anne had been one of genuine love, rare in the world of royal politics. The thought of replacing her felt like betraying her memory. But duty to the realm had a way of overwhelming personal sentiment, especially when French ambassadors arrived with a proposal that promised to solve multiple problems simultaneously. The French offer was breathtaking in its scope. They would provide not just a royal bride, but a dowry of 800,000 francs, a sum so enormous it could refill England's war-depleted treasury. More incredibly, they offered a 28-year truce, long enough for an entire generation to grow up without knowing the horror of war. There was just one complication that would scandalize even medieval sensibilities. The proposed bride was only 6 years old. Even by the standards of an age where 12-year-old brides were common, marrying a 6-year-old child pushed the boundaries of acceptability. Medieval marriage law required that unions not be consummated until the bride reached physical maturity, but the very idea of a grown man wedding a child who could barely read her own name created whispers of unease in both courts. Yet the political logic was undeniable. Isabella's extreme youth was actually an advantage from a diplomatic perspective. She would be raised at the English court, learning English customs and developing English loyalties. By the time she was old enough to rule as queen consort, she would be as much English as French, a living bridge between two nations that had spent decades trying to destroy each other. Richard himself seemed intrigued by an aspect of the arrangement that his advisors barely understood. Court observers noted that when he saw the miniature portrait of Isabella sent by the French ambassadors, something in his expression softened. Here was a child who would need protection, guidance, and care. Perhaps some whispered the childless king saw in this unusual arrangement not just a political alliance, but the opportunity to be a father figure as well as a husband. The negotiations stretched across months, with ambassadors crossing the treacherous waters of the English Channel repeatedly to hammer out every detail of this unprecedented arrangement. Every aspect of Isabella's future life was debated and codified with the precision of a military campaign. She would be allowed to keep her French servants and ladies-in-waiting, ensuring she wouldn't be completely cut off from her homeland. She could maintain correspondence with her family in Paris, though every letter would undoubtedly be read by English officials. Most crucially, the treaty explicitly stated that the marriage would remain unconsummated until Isabella reached what medieval law considered the age of consent. But while diplomats haggled over dowries and diplomatic protocol, 6-year-old Isabella played with her dolls in the palace, gardens blissfully unaware that her entire future was being written in ink and sealed with wax in chambers she'd never seen. Her tutors had begun teaching her simple English phrases, and palace seamstresses were already at work, creating a trousseau fit for a queen. But to Isabella, the idea of marrying a king across the sea was no more real than the fairy tales her nurses told at bedtime. The complexity of this arrangement went far beyond simple marriage negotiations. What Richard and the French court were orchestrating was essentially a 28-year experiment in human engineering. They were betting that a child's personality and loyalties could be fundamentally reshaped by environment and education, that Isabella could be transformed from a French princess into an English queen without losing the diplomatic value that made her precious to both kingdoms. This wasn't just marriage. This was the medieval equivalent of a witness protection program, where Isabella would be given an entirely new identity while still somehow remaining herself. The psychological implications were staggering, though medieval minds didn't think in such terms. They were essentially asking a 6-year-old to become a living symbol of peace between two nations that had been mortal enemies since before she was born. The wedding ceremony itself would happen twice, reflecting the delicate diplomatic dance required to make this union acceptable to both kingdoms. The first ceremony took place in Calais, the English-controlled port on French soil, providing neutral ground for this historic moment. Isabella, now 7 years old, stood in the great hall of Calais Castle, wearing a gown of cloth of gold so heavily embroidered with pearls that she needed help walking. Picture that scene through Isabella's eyes. She's surrounded by men speaking a language she barely understands, their voices echoing off stone walls that dwarf her tiny frame. Her new husband kneels to her level to exchange rings, and she can see kindness in his eyes even as she struggles to comprehend the magnitude of what is happening to her. The assembled nobles watch with the intensity of people witnessing history, but to Isabella, It must have felt like being the central figure in a play she didn't understand. The second ceremony, her coronation as Queen of England, took place a year later in Westminster Abbey and was designed to be one of the most spectacular royal events in English history. The English people had heard tales of their child queen, and curiosity drew massive crowds to London. Contemporary chroniclers reported that several people died in the crush to catch a glimpse of the famous young bride. Isabella processed through London streets in a litter decorated with English roses and French fleur-de-lis, symbolizing the union of two kingdoms. She wore a crown specially crafted for her small head, its weight distributed carefully so it wouldn't strain her neck. English duchesses, chosen to serve as her guardians and teachers, carried her train while crowds called out blessings in a language she was still learning to speak. The coronation feast lasted 3 days and featured entertainment that would have impressed even the sophisticated French court. Jugglers, musicians, and elaborate theatrical presentations depicted the glorious future this marriage would bring to both kingdoms. Isabella sat at the high table beside Richard, carefully managing her eating with the precise manners her tutors had drilled into her, while nobles throughout the hall toasted the health of their child queen. But even as the celebrations continued, experienced courtiers were already wondering how long this peace would last. Medieval truces, no matter how elaborately negotiated, were fragile things built on assumptions that could shift with changing circumstances. Richard might be secure on his throne today, but royal power in medieval England was always contested, always vulnerable to the ambitions of powerful nobles who might not share his commitment to peace with France. For now, though, Isabella was safe in her new home. Richard had installed her in her own apartments at Westminster Palace, staffed with a carefully chosen household that blended French and English attendants. Her daily routine was structured around education, not just the typical feminine accomplishments of needlework and music, but languages, history, and the complex etiquette of English court life. She learned to curtsy in the English fashion, to prefer wine over ale at meals, and to speak English with the refined accent of the court, rather than the pronunciation her French tutors had taught her. Richard himself took an active interest in her welfare, visiting her apartments regularly with gifts from across his realm. Exotic birds from Ireland, illuminated manuscripts from Oxford, musical instruments crafted by London's finest artisans. The relationship that developed between them was unlike anything in the standard patterns of royal marriage. Richard seemed to genuinely enjoy Isabella's company, and she began to look forward to his visits, greeting him with a mixture of formal respect and childlike affection that appeared to charm the often melancholy king. Their interactions had observers struggling to define what they were witnessing. Was this a marriage, a guardianship, or something entirely unprecedented? Isabella found companionship among the other children at court, particularly Margaret Holland, daughter of one of Richard's supporters. Margaret was only 2 years older, but seemed worldly and sophisticated to the young queen. It was Margaret who taught Isabella English children's games, who helped her understand which ladies-in-waiting could be trusted with secrets, and who began to explain the undercurrents of political tension that even children couldn't entirely escape. Through Margaret, Isabella began to understand that her marriage was more than just a personal arrangement. It was a cornerstone of Richard's political strategy. The peace with France gave him breathing room to deal with domestic challenges, but it also made him vulnerable to criticism from English nobles who believed he was showing weakness by negotiating rather than conquering. The years 1397 and 1398 unfolded like pages from a fairy tale for young Isabella. But beneath the surface, the kingdom that had welcomed her with such ceremony was beginning to fracture. She had grown from a frightened child into a more confident girl of 8 and 9, her English now fluent, her understanding of court life increasingly sophisticated. The massive stone walls of Westminster had transformed from intimidating barriers into familiar corridors she could navigate without getting lost. Richard continued his paternal visits, but Isabella began to notice subtle changes in his demeanor. The gifts became less frequent, and when he did come to her apartments, he seemed distracted, often staring out the windows toward the Thames, as if expecting to see something troubling on the horizon. His usual gentle questions about her studies were replaced by longer silences, and sometimes she would catch him watching her with an expression she could and quite understand, something that mixed affection with what almost like pity. The truth was far more ominous than a 9-year-old could grasp. Richard was facing the greatest political crisis of his reign, and it had nothing to do with his young queen. His cousin Henry Bolingbroke, whom Richard had exiled the previous year in a dispute over inheritance rights, had returned to England with an army, ostensibly to reclaim his father's lands, but clearly harboring far greater ambitions. The English nobility, many of whom had long resented Richard's autocratic tendencies and his preference for court favorites over traditional counselors, began flocking to Henry's banner with alarming speed. The carefully constructed stability that had allowed Isabella to feel secure in her adoptive homeland was crumbling like a sandcastle before an incoming tide. Isabella first sensed something was seriously wrong when she woke one morning to discover that several of her English ladies-in-waiting had vanished during the night. When she asked her French attendants where they had gone, she received only evasive answers and nervous glances. By afternoon, she could hear shouting from the courtyard below her windows, and when she looked out, she saw armed men wearing livery she didn't recognize. Margaret Holland burst into Isabella's chambers that evening, her face pale with the fear that made her look far younger than her 11 years. "You must pack immediately," she whispered urgently, her voice barely audible above the sound of her own rapid breathing. "Only the most essential things. We're leaving Westminster tonight." "Where are we going?" Isabella asked, though the sinking feeling in her stomach already suggested she wouldn't like the answer. "To the Tower," Margaret replied, and both girls understood the implications. The Tower of London served as both royal palace and state prison, and the distinction often depended entirely on political circumstances beyond anyone's control. The journey through London's dark streets was unlike any experience in Isabella's previous life. Instead of the ceremonial processions she was accustomed to, they traveled in a small, heavily guarded convoy that moved through the city like fugitives fleeing justice. The curtains of her litter were drawn tight, but she could hear the sounds of the city around them. Not the usual bustle of commerce and daily life, but something more urgent and threatening. At the Tower, Isabella was installed in apartments that were comfortable enough, but clearly designed more for containment than hospitality. The windows were barred. Guards stood at every entrance, and her French ladies-in-waiting, while allowed to remain, were the only familiar faces in a sea of strangers who watched her every movement with calculating eyes. Richard came to see her on her second day of confinement, and the transformation in him was so complete that Isabella barely recognized the man who had been her protector and guide. The confident, cultured king she had known was gone, replaced by someone who seemed to have aged a decade in a matter of days. His clothes were disheveled, his hair unkempt, and his eyes held a wildness that reminded Isabella uncomfortably of her father's episodes of madness. "My dear child," he said, kneeling before her chair, as he had done during their first meeting years earlier. But now the gesture seemed more desperate than courtly. "I'm afraid our circumstances have become rather difficult. There are those who question my right to rule, who seek to overturn everything we have built together." Isabella, now 9 years old, and far more politically sophisticated than she had been when she first arrived in England, asked the question that mattered most. "Are you still king?" Richard's smile was bitter and brittle. "For now. But Henry Bolingbroke has gathered many supporters, and I may not be able to protect you as I once could." What followed was unlike any conversation they had ever shared. For the first time, Richard spoke to Isabella not as a child to be sheltered from harsh realities, but as a political equal who needed to understand the forces that were reshaping her world. He explained that Henry was claiming the throne, that many of England's greatest nobles had abandoned Richard's cause, and that the future of both the kingdom and the peace with France now hung in the balance. "What will happen to me?" Isabella asked, displaying a composure that would have been remarkable in an adult, let alone a 9-year-old girl, facing the collapse of everything she had known. "I don't know," Richard admitted, and Isabella could see that this uncertainty tormented him more than his own precarious position. "Henry may seek to use you as a bargaining chip with your father, or he may choose to honor our marriage and continue protecting you. Much depends on whether he values peace with France above his own ambitions for conquest." This conversation marked Isabella's true initiation into the brutal arithmetic of medieval politics. She began to understand that her value as a person was secondary to her value as a symbol and diplomatic asset. The genuine affection Richard had shown her, real though it had been, could not shield her from the larger forces that were reshaping the English kingdom according to the will of ambitious men who saw her only as a useful tool or an inconvenient obstacle. The weeks that followed passed in agonizing uncertainty. Isabella could hear the sounds of the city beyond the tower walls, sometimes the clatter of armed men, sometimes the roar of crowds, sometimes an eerie silence that was somehow more frightening than noise. She was cut off from reliable news about what was happening, dependent on whispered fragments of information from servants who themselves knew little beyond rumors and speculation. Her French ladies-in-waiting tried to maintain some semblance of normal routine, continuing her lessons in literature and music, but everyone was simply going through the motions of a life that had been fundamentally disrupted. Isabella could see the fear in their eyes, could hear the way their voices changed when they spoke in French, thinking she couldn't understand their rapid, worried conversations about what might happen to them all. The uncertainty ended on a gray October morning when Isabella heard the sound she had been dreading, the heavy footsteps of armed men approaching her chambers with purpose rather than routine patrol. When the doors opened, she saw not the guards she had become accustomed to, but new men wearing the red rose livery of Henry Bolingbroke. The man who entered behind them was tall and imposing, with the bearing of a professional soldier and the calculating eyes of someone who had spent years planning for this moment. This was Henry himself, now Henry IV of England, come to meet the child who represented both an opportunity and a complication for his newly claimed crown. Isabella rose from her chair and curtsied deeply, as she had been taught to do when meeting any person of high rank, but especially when meeting a king. Henry studied her for a long moment, taking in her obvious intelligence, her carefully controlled composure, and perhaps calculating exactly how much diplomatic value she represented. "Your Grace," he said formally, and Isabella noted that he still used her royal title, a small sign that might indicate his intentions toward her. "What has become of the king?" Isabella asked, referring to Richard with the directness that had become her trademark when dealing with serious matters. "Richard of Bordeaux is no longer king," Henry replied, using Richard's birth name rather than his royal title. "He has abdicated in favor of my rightful claim to the throne." Isabella was sophisticated enough to understand that abdicated was almost certainly a euphemism for was forced to surrender the crown, but she didn't challenge the polite fiction. Instead, she asked the question that would determine her immediate future: "What becomes of me?" Henry's answer revealed the careful calculation behind every word. "That depends on many factors. Your father's response to recent events, the counsel of my advisers, and perhaps most importantly, your own conduct in the coming months." With those words, 9-year-old Isabella entered the most dangerous period of her young life. The protective environment Richard had created for her was gone, replaced by the harsh realities of a kingdom in political transition. She was no longer just a child queen being prepared for her future role. She had become a valuable prisoner whose fate would be decided by men who measured her worth against the potential costs of war or peace. The months that followed were a masterclass in survival for a child who had already experienced more political upheaval than most adults would face in a lifetime. Isabella found herself walking a tightrope between competing factions, each trying to determine how best to use her for their own purposes. Some of Henry's supporters argued she should be shipped back to France immediately, both to save the expense of maintaining her household and to signal England's readiness to renegotiate the peace treaty from a position of strength. Others counseled patience, recognizing that Isabella's presence gave England valuable leverage in future negotiations with France. As long as she remained in English custody, her father would hesitate before taking any action that might endanger his daughter's welfare. This faction argued she should be maintained in comfort, but kept under careful surveillance. Isabella herself played her role with remarkable skill for such a young girl. She remained unfailingly polite to her captors, careful never to give offense or appear to be plotting against Henry's government. Yet she also maintained the dignity befitting her rank, refusing to be treated as anything less than the queen she legally remained. Her French ladies-in-waiting proved invaluable during this delicate period, helping her navigate the subtle currents of a court that was still deciding what to do with her. The news of Richard's death in captivity hit Isabella with unexpected force. She had never loved him as a wife loves a husband. How could she, when she was still a child? But he had been her protector, her guide into the complexities of English court life, the closest thing to a father figure she had known since leaving France. His murder, for everyone understood it was murder despite the official claims of natural death, severed her last connection to the life she had built in England. More ominously, Richard's fate demonstrated Henry's willingness to eliminate obstacles through violence. If he could arrange the death of an anointed king, what qualms would he have about disposing of a French princess who had outlived her usefulness? These fears crystallized when Henry's government presented Isabella with an ultimatum that would determine her future. She could return to France, but only if she formally acknowledged Henry as England's rightful king and renounced any claims she might have to the English throne as Richard's widow. The proposed agreement was diplomatically brilliant from Henry's perspective. By voluntarily leaving England, Isabella would implicitly accept that her marriage had been dissolved by Richard's deposition. For Isabella, now 10 years old, the choice was stark. Accept exile and acknowledge that her years as Queen of England had been meaningless, or refuse and risk remaining a prisoner indefinitely. The decision was ultimately made for her when her father, during one of his lucid periods, demanded his daughter's immediate return to France. The journey back to Paris in 1401 was bittersweet beyond description. Isabella was leaving behind everything she had known for 5 formative years: the apartments where she had learned to read English poetry, the gardens where she had played with Margaret Holland, the great hall where she had been crowned. Yet she was also returning to a family that had become foreign to her during her absence, speaking French with a slight English accent that marked her as an outsider in her own homeland. Back in France, Isabella faced the complex task of reintegrating into a world she had left as a child and was returning to as a young woman shaped by experiences none of her relatives could fully understand. Her father's deteriorating mental condition meant their reunion was complicated by his inability to recognize her during his worst episodes. Her mother, while more welcoming, immediately began calculating how Isabella's unique position might serve French interests. As the former Queen of England, Isabella possessed diplomatic status that could prove valuable in future negotiations. More immediately, her intimate knowledge of English court life made her a treasure trove of intelligence about England's political and military capabilities. Isabella found herself caught between competing demands, providing general information while carefully avoiding details that might be used to plan military campaigns against the country that had been her own. The question of Isabella's future marriage became increasingly pressing as she entered adolescence. Her status as a former queen made her an attractive prospect for European nobles, but it also complicated potential matches. Some suitors were intimidated by her royal rank and political significance. Others were more interested in the diplomatic advantages of marrying her than in Isabella herself. The solution came through her cousin Charles of Orleans, a cultured nobleman who offered Isabella something she had never experienced, a marriage based on mutual respect and genuine affection. Their wedding in 1406 marked the beginning of the happiest period of Isabella's life. Charles proved to be not only a devoted husband, but an intellectual companion who valued her insights and experiences. For the first time since childhood, Isabella felt she truly belonged somewhere. She threw herself into her new role with enthusiasm, patronizing artists and scholars, establishing cultural exchanges, and becoming a true partner in governing their territories. The birth of their children brought her profound joy, but also renewed her determination that they would have the choices she had been denied. Isabella's health, however, had been permanently damaged by the stresses of her early life and difficult childbirths. The strong constitution that had carried her through political upheavals began to fail her, and she faced the prospect of early death with the same courage she had shown throughout her remarkable life. When Isabella of Valois died in 1409, at just 20 years old, she left behind a legacy that transcended the specific circumstances of her birth and upbringing. She had demonstrated that even those born into impossible situations could find ways to exercise agency, show compassion, and create meaning from their experiences. Her story remains a testament to human resilience and the enduring power of intelligence and dignity in the face of overwhelming odds. The little girl who had stood trembling in Westminster Abbey at age 6 had grown into a woman who shaped the course of European diplomacy through her courage, wisdom, and refusal to be defined solely by the political machinations that had controlled her childhood. In death, she achieved something that had eluded her in life, the freedom to be remembered not just as a pawn in medieval power games, but as a remarkable individual who had transformed every challenge into an opportunity for grace.